Alright, so this one came about from some debate when I made the schedule for this whole horror month of verses, and I realized that I didn't have a vampire-themed one, and it seemed sort of like something was missing because of that. So I thought about stuff like Fright Night and other like classics, but they just didn't. There weren't two that really lined up, and then this one kind of got suggested to me at the last minute, and it's like, yeah, I suppose that does make sense. So, yeah, we'll do this. Why not? They're two totally and completely different movies, but as far as like the vague outline, I guess you could say they're both vampire-themed comedies from the '80s, where the main character, has like a sort of sexual run-in that leads to the possibility that they might be a vampire. One of them may be a bit more likely, one of them may be a bit more ambiguous. And obviously, tonally, we may end up in two totally different areas. But, and obviously, one of my favorite things to talk about is Nicolas Cage movies. And specifically his performances in them, especially when he just goes totally and completely into his own thing. Like it's just him and his element when you just kind of let him unleash. There was even a point in time where the director was, I can't remember if it was on the commentary, if he was interviewed, but he talked about how there's one scene in particular in this movie where no matter how much he looks back on it, he still can't believe that he just kind of gave Cage free reign in this particular scene. But the thing about that is that I guess we'll go ahead and start with Vampire's Kiss, where it's what we see today whenever a Nicolas Cage movie comes out, whether it be in theaters or straight to DVD. The appeal of him is that you never know quite what he's going to do, and whether he's going to remain calm or whether he's going to go off the deep end. Most of the time it's off the deep end, and it's usually glorious. And Vampire's Kiss kind of feels like the birth of that, in a way. It was like, because he'd done, obviously, some interesting experimentation with, like, The Voice and Peggy Sue Got Married, which happened with which Carrie co-starred with him in between these movies. And then Moonstruck was a couple of years before it, where he got to go a little over the top. Not as over the top as he wanted to, if you hear him talk about Moonstruck, but it's... Yeah, but I feel like this is kind of the ultimate jumping off point of this movie is the reason a lot of people expect the things out of Cage that we now do. Where he's just willing to go, no matter, it doesn't matter if the movie's going to be some huge success or some movie nobody's going to see. He's going to put everything in that he's got. He's just going to put all of his chips forward and just completely go off if he has to. And sometimes even if it's not necessary, which can honestly, like, there were some people who were considered for this movie, but it's like, this just kind of would have been a totally, you can just tell it would have been a totally different movie, without his performance in this. Like, it's not even, like, I don't think, it wouldn't even be close to the same movie if it was another actor, because there's no way they were going to be doing the things that he does here, and have this sort of... I definitely can't imagine we could have gotten a more memorable movie with anybody else, for sure. Because this is a movie that actually kind of just went off and got forgotten, which is really bizarre, because you would think... I think it's mainly just that like, not many people saw it when it came out, because it's like, if a lot of people had seen this when it came out, it would have a much more... Like, it finally found life again through memes, apparently. But, I mean, if this had been a widely seen movie back when it came out, there's no way anybody would have forgotten about it. But it's also a case of... You can just imagine that... Obviously, he had, Peggy Sue and Moonstruck and Valley Girl and stuff like that by then. But still, it's like... You watch this movie and you imagine yourself as an audience member in like '89 when it came out, and you're like, either this guy is gonna be huge, or we're never gonna see him again. And it'll always be that case of, what happened to that insane dude that was in that vampire movie? And of course he went on to be huge, of course. And he was kind of already on his way there by this point, but yeah, so it's so weird how this movie just kind of slipped through the cracks for so long before finally like finding its life again and finding a sort of cult status. Um, and as just immediately when the movie starts, after we get the ominous imagery of New York through the opening credits, um, which we'll go into is like a whole different sort of horror aspect of the movie in itself. But then we get this first scene with him in his psychiatrist's office, which is exactly the kind of place you'd expect to find this character the first time we see him is in a psychiatrist's office. And he's doing that voice that I think a lot of people had a hard time like pinpointing. I think there's a lot of misconception that he's supposed to have like a certain accent. When I first saw it, I remember taking it as like it was sort of like how when you think of like the Transylvanian accent and how it's like vampires have that certain way of speaking in like general pop culture where it's like you can't exactly put I mean apart from Transylvanian, but there's still always like this weirdness to it where you can't quite pinpoint exactly what kind of accent it is. But apparently Cage said something about that the whole accent is like made up by his character. That's not actually the way his character speaks, but it makes it like he goes around speaking that way, hoping he'll look like sophisticated, and he's failing miserably, which makes perfect sense. So that's another thing too is it's always really fun to listen to Cage talk about some of the decisions he's made in the past. And like in his defense of how the Wicker Man turned out, which I've talked about endlessly, and it's like you can just tell like how this just enormous misconception that he's a bad actor has gotten out there because of performances like this where he goes all out. But it's like when you listen to his method, it's like there is something in there and there is a reason for it. And it's just so incredibly fascinating is what I think brings people back to him so many times, regardless of the kind of movie it is, whether it's something straight to DVD or whether it's a Joe or a Mandy. There's always a method to what exactly is going on, even if it seems like it's totally and completely out of control. And sometimes it may even be totally out of control, but that's also in itself kind of an artistic choice anyway. I'm just so yeah, the idea of just letting him run with it is something I'm totally on board for. And it does seem like a role that was more or less made for him. Like I said, despite the other people mentioned, or that were considered. I heard something about there was Judd Nelson at one point, which kind of makes sense. But then apparently, Schwarzenegger and Stallone had been talked to, and that's where I talk about where it's like I feel like they had a totally different movie in mind here before Cage got involved, and I'm kind of glad that it's this movie instead. So when it begins, he goes back to the apartment with his girlfriend, and they're getting ready to have a night in when they're terrorized by a bat, a really fat ass bat flying around the apartment. And like I said, I feel like only Nicolas Cage could be the actor that goes back to his psychiatrist after that night and says that he was turned on by this experience with the bat. Which is kind of the jumping off point for the rest of the crazy shit that happens here. When he has a run-in with Jennifer Beals, who bites him while they're in the middle of while they're in bed together. And and then there's this whole weird thing going on throughout the movie where like, is Jennifer Beals even real or not? And I think the general conclusion is like, he must have seen her in that club at some point, and it's like there's the whole ambiguous thing of did they ever go back to his place at all? Because we immediately have the next morning where he has this imaginary run-in with her where he cuts himself shaving conveniently where she supposedly bit him, and then he goes and takes her coffee to bed and is just talking to her and looking there as if she's there, and a reveal shows us that she's not there. And it's like we get this back and forth of whenever he actually sees her and she seems to actually be there, it's always at night, but then always the next morning he's just talking to himself as if she's there. Like the scene where he invites her into the shower also. And so it's like, is it a supernatural thing, or is this somebody descending into insanity? I think many times I like the ambiguity of it that's there, but I like to think the movie after a while is pretty clear that this is just somebody descending totally into insanity. um, but the thing about that also is there is the moment at the end in the club when she's there and the dude's there, and there seems to be that whole thing where yes, she's a vampire, but then when he goes out there, it's like she has no idea what's going on. So I'm going to assume that the ambiguity is up in the air. I wouldn't say there's any definitive answer of whether they went home together the first time, but she seems so like surprised by his presence at the end. I think there's a good possibility not even that happened. Like there was a chance he just spotted her from a distance and his mind went with it from there. Because obviously, Peter Lorre, the character he's playing, this is a mind that is just hardly there anymore. And like I said, the fact that that opens so many doors for Cage to do his Cage thing is really the magic of this movie. Because there's like even when it's like a sort of over the top thing that seems like it's just because there's still kind of something to it. Like one of the times when he gets called by there's that whole subplot going on of this missing contract, and the guy calls him about it. And when he gets that call, he just he juts his jaw out, seemingly out of like frustration or something. Until you realize that's like the same movement he does once he's got the plastic vampire teeth in his mouth, and then it's like it's part of his transformation or something. But just in the moment, it just seems like this. Yeah, it's funny that it's kind of it's hilarious to watch his descent, but kind of the genius of the movie is how it goes from hilarious, and it kind of stays, intentionally funny. It's obviously a self-proclaimed dark comedy, so that's the point. But it's like as he descends, it stays funny throughout, but there's also the line between what's funny and what's kind of starts to get genuinely disturbing. I think that's another thing that Cage doesn't quite get enough credit for this movie, because of course, people want to talk about the ABC scene or him running down the street screaming that he's a vampire, and it's like even the ABC scene is really funny where he's in the psychiatrist's office and he's talking about how frustrating it is that Alva can't find one file even though they should be alphabetized. So he goes through the entire alphabet, possibly being the only actor that's done that in a movie ever. But the thing is when you watch like his movement as he's doing, it's not just that he goes through the entire alphabet, but you can like see his body regressing into almost like a childlike state, where he does the arm folding and then he puts his hands on his hips, and you can just see like everything coming down the farther he gets, and by the time he gets to Z, this is a person that's long gone. So even that stuff I feel like actually serves a purpose rather than just being over the top for the sake of being over the top. But then I talk about stuff where the director actually just let him go off. Apparently, the scene where he destroys his apartment, where none of that was like props, it was all real stuff, and so they only had one take to do this, and they set up like 2 cameras, and the director just said, "All right, just do it." So we get everything that we get, and somehow it's still so. It seems almost choreographed in how perfect it ended up. Particularly that moment where he kicks the lamp and it just immediately like bursts. And so it just the way it's able to work out like that, even when it seems just totally unleashed and out of control, is just what makes it really work. So, and then there's the whole thing about him eating a cockroach. I'd heard something about like animal rights groups or something got on him for that, and his defense, which pretty much shut the whole thing up, was, "Are you telling me you've never used a can of Raid? And you're going to be the people that defend cockroaches?" But and it also kind of reminds me of that old story about Ozzy Osbourne biting the head off a bat, where it's like people think he's insane for doing that, and it's this whole thing, but it's like when he actually tells the story, it's like, well, no, I didn't get any pleasure out of it at all. And it was the same thing with Cage and the cockroach, where it's like he said everything in his body was saying, "Don't do this," but he just did it for that one take, and it's so to really go into that, just that commitment to go full on into the depravity of all this, just it has to be commended. And I kind of hate that it's like solely through like memes anymore that this gets that kind of attention, because it really is like, and it might seem silly too, for the kind of movie that it is, and some people might dismiss it as just an over the top comedic performance. But I mean, you really can't take away his commitment to this. It's just kind of too perfect, especially for a role like this, especially when it's what keeps the movie alive. Because there is a lot, like people like get so much into this is the movie where Cage just goes insane. I sometimes forget how much is going on in this movie, like story wise, and the whole Alva subplot that's going on between with her and her brother, and the fact that she's dealing with should she or should she not be carrying this gun around, and the way the city is like eating everybody alive, and this whole thing with the lost file is like a really big thing, and then the fact that that Peter goes into like this full predatory mode with her, and there's like this whole sort of you would say a misogynistic thing, but I think it goes even beyond that. There's something so fucked up between his thought process when it comes to her. And it's worth noting she's played very well by Maria Conchita Alonso, but this whole story where it's like the whole thing about the missing file is something that he just latches onto, almost like a vampire to a neck, I suppose, if you want to say that. Especially when he gets to the point where he takes the guy's call and he's like, "Hey, we lost that contract and we can't find it," and the guy's like, "Well, that's no big deal. Like, it's really nothing, honestly." But he latches onto this and uses it as a way to be like so predatory to her, where it's like when he's told over the phone that it's not a big deal, it's like he gets more like he hates her more because of that, because he almost lost that attachment to her or something, and it becomes like this whole obsessive thing, and then but the way it just keeps getting more and more degrading to her, the whole monologue he has about the totem pole and being below that, and like just how the horrible job and she's the one with the horrible job and all that, and it just gets real, like that's where it kind of goes into the whole, it kind of stops being funny and gets like really disturbing, and then which is really like the movie makes his descent go in that direction so much that it's not even necessarily like a drastic tonal shift like for the worst. It like we gradually seem to get to that point, and it just goes off the rails even more there. And talking about the whole misogyny aspect, particularly in the workplace, and the way the guys like see the women that work around there, it's like there is that particular scene where it's like it's almost like a scene out of In the Company of Men, where it's like it's almost like it's calling out the way those guys are, but it's also like a parody of that also. So that's a whole thing in itself. And like I said, then there's this whole other thing about the city itself, where it's like, I said we just get these ominous exterior shots of it, but then it's like the way the movie delves into the insanity of the city itself, and just sometimes there's weird little touches, like the masked performers outside of his apartment building, and then there's the scene where Alva gets on the subway, and it's like going through the city and on the subway, she might as well be going through like a haunted house, the way this scene plays out. And so this whole thing just has this sort of building, just thing about it, this feeling that kind of gets under your skin. And then by the time it gets to towards the ending, where it really like embraces both the hilarious and the disturbing, when he just hallucinates an entire thing in his psychiatrist's office as he's carrying around this giant board that he's trying to get innocent bystanders to kill him with, which ultimately leads to his final run-in with Alva's brother, that leads to this very dark scene of his demise that just ends the movie. Sort of in the way there's the point in time in the middle where he's watching Nosferatu, and it's the very end of the movie, when Orlok gets killed by the sunlight, and it's like the way that Nosferatu just pretty much ends there, is sort of the same way the movie goes. It's like once the threat is gone and the sun comes up, there's just nothing else to say. And to think that it's all just basically a dude just going completely insane, it's like it's like the dark comedy aspect of it sort of like wears away, and then you're just left with what the actual scenario was by this ending, and I could see it leaving a bad taste in people's mouths, honestly. But I mean, just the way of what the movie started off as and continued to be, and ultimately ending up at this point, there is something just really there's just not really another movie like this. Whether it be Cage's performance or the outcome of it or all the different things it's doing, it's really just its own thing. So yeah, that's really where that leaves off. And also talking about the Nosferatu thing, also the way he sort of walks through the club doing like the movements that Max Schreck was like, just another thing that adds to this performance. And like where I said, actually it serves a purpose, even if it seems like it's just over the top for over the top's sake. And like I said, if that's the way you view Cage as an actor, maybe if you look again, there might be something under the insanity. So so yeah, and then like I said, that this kind of became the starting point of when in his other movies does he reach points like this. But I think it kind of reached a peak here in regards to just how far he was able to go. But he's still consistently putting stuff out there. So yeah. So like I said, completely different tone going into Once Bitten, which is really just kind of this, like, I don't think this movie would really have much of a reputation at all. It kind of already doesn't. It's just kind of a movie that exists. But I think the thing that really kind of makes it still in the minds of people is it was pretty much the debut of Jim Carrey, at least movie-wise. Like, he had some, shitty whatever made for TV or straight to video movies like Copper Mountain and that bullshit. Don't seek anything pre Once Bitten out of Jim Carrey's is what I'm trying to say. I can't remember exactly what years his stint on In Living Color was, but this is basically known as his first movie, and pretty much that significance alone, I think, is what's really kept the movie from like going completely and totally into obscurity. But I feel it's also a movie I feel like probably has its fans out there, especially when you get this opening scene. This opening credit scene that basically shows us that Cleon Little owns this movie. This is like one of the only other things a lot of people know him for besides Blazing Saddles, unfortunately. But still, there is a reason for that because he just this whole opening alone, where he's walking around and preparing like the mansion, and then waking up Lauren Hutton, and then we get the whole vibe of this whole vampire vibe. Just kind of sets up what maybe should have been the tone for the rest of the movie, but obviously there's going to be some back and forth here because we've also got a teen comedy going on here, or attempted teen comedy, with Jim Carrey in his ice cream truck, and his friends that are all trying to get laid, and his girlfriend that he can't quite get into bed yet. He can't convince her. So he is the perfect virgin for the blood that Lauren Hutton needs to continue surviving and keep her youth. So pretty much immediately we go into the teen comedy aspect, and there's a lot of really dated jokes, very 1985 jokes. When they go to that, I'm not even sure what the hell that place is, where you go to tables and you can call up other tables, and then it's like sort of like a speed dating thing, only a bit more unorganized. I don't know. But, of course, one of Carrie's buddies gets called over, and there's a woman there waiting for him, but the woman is actually a dude in drag, and it's a whole thing. And it's like, yeah, that's very 1985 of this movie. But then there's jokes like that are dated mainly through phrasing. Like the phrase "fag alert" in the shower scene, and it's like the phrasing alone dates the scene, which is a shame because, and you would think it was also it's another kind of homophobic joke, but the setup to the joke isn't that bad, and it's like more or less, believe it or not, it's a joke that kind of works. This just kind of gets dated by the phrasing, so every now and then it's like. There is something, that's kind of what a lot of the comedy in this movie is. It's like you can see the hints of, oh yeah, I can see where this joke could work. But then it just kind of, but then there's a lot of jokes that are just completely and totally dead ends. Like, the scene where he's starting to turn into a vampire, I guess. And he goes into the wrong classroom and starts to dissect a frog. And then the teacher comes in and says, "Hey, you're in the wrong class." And he's like, "Oh," and he just clumsily puts the frog back together and then clumsily leaves the room. This joke doesn't really have anything to do with anything, and pretty much falls flat, and it's just in there. And it's jokes like that that kind of put you off when you realize that this movie has three writers. It has three writers, and then a separate dude that gets the story credit. And we get scenes like the frog dissection. So, but then there's still some stuff in there, but there are jokes that are set up to where it seemed like they were supposed to go somewhere, but then they just didn't elaborate. Like the fact that he drives an ice cream truck. See, it seems like there's supposed to be a joke there somewhere. Not that giving a character a funny vehicle has ever really worked, as far as I can remember. It's kind of a kiss of death, that whole joke in general. But there's really seems to be no particular payoff to it at all. Like not even an attempt at one. And that just kind of ends up confusing. It's like why have setups with no payoffs whatsoever? But this movie kind of has that quite a bit. And it also seems like there's not enough material. Like, they have the comedic setup of, you have this kid that's just trying to be a teenager and get laid, but he might also be turning into a vampire. Um, but they get so sidetracked all the time. Like his two friends have a full scene all to themselves that has nothing to do with anything, where they're in a laundromat. And there are two women there, and they try to hook up with them, but one of them is like, I guess, too kinky or something, because she's like, "Oh yeah, why don't you?" She's too into it. She's like, "Oh, come to my place and I'll tie you up or something." It's like, if he's that desperate, why is this? It can't be that off-putting. But apparently that's terrifying. And then he comes back, and there's the kind of funny reveal of, we don't see the interaction with the other friend and the other girl. Just the other friend walks by, and the dude's just in the washing machine, and the girl's gone. But then once it's over, you're like, oh yes, that just literally had nothing to do with anything. This hour-and-a-half movie needed this entire scene of filler. Because even the jokes that try to go on the subject matter of the movie are, I would say, hit and miss, but they're kind of mostly miss. But it's not entirely like the hits are non-existent. Like every now and then, they sort of find a particular stride, but for the most part, it kind of fails as a comedy for the most part. But what I think kind of helps it makes this movie not entirely, like, completely off-putting, and especially talking about the way the guys react to certain things and the lengths they'll go to get laid. Even the way he, like, goes after Lauren Hutton, even though he's got this, loving girlfriend here. There is something that, like, there's a scene that makes Carrie's character likable. Like, likable enough to get you through the movie, despite some of the decisions he makes, where he talks about, like, it's kind of a real moment for a movie like this, where he, like, calls out his own behavior and, like, the fact that he knows that they're doing stupid things because they're teenagers, and it's like everybody at this school is doing stupid things, and it's like the fact that he's conscious of that. So it's like, and you can actually see that, like, even though it seems like his character just wants to get her in bed, it's like there is something in this scene that shows that he genuinely cares about her. So there's something to that, I guess. But then, once again, comedic situations start trying to work their way back into this movie, this comedy. And because you got the contrived situations, and normally this would be a case, like the shower scene, more or less, where it's like, if the setup, works enough, you can have a situation there, and that's where movies like this should really shine. Just this sort of situational comedy that they find themselves in. But then you get this scene that just really falls flat when he goes into a dressing room, and it makes the character of his girlfriend just so weirdly oblivious to what's happening. And, like, because Lauren Hunt's in there with him, and she just comes off so incredibly clueless in this scene. and there's no real payoff to it that you can see where this could have potentially have been comedic gold in another more well-written movie, in like a tighter comedy, but it's just there. It's not even a comedic situation. It's just a situation. And that's it. And so that and that's like I said, this is the kind of stuff that movies like this can really care. Like this is what can, even if your story is failing, this is the kind of stuff that can keep a comedy alive. It's just the individual situations. If they work enough, then there's something here. But yeah. So but then you have the dance scene, which is fine, even though it makes the dressing room scene even worse. Because the whole running joke of this scene is that he just puts on a coat and his sunglasses and he's just not going in a costume. But everybody keeps saying, oh, you're going as a vampire, and he has to keep insisting he's not wearing a costume. But it's like the fact that he's trying to keep all this secret, and she just sees him, and immediately the first thing she says is, oh, you're going as a vampire, that's great. Like really, so she's not as oblivious as that dressing room scene makes her, obviously. So that just kind of adds a whole lot of unevenness to it. But I do kind of like this dancing, because that's kind of a funny running joke that people keep saying, oh, you told us you're going as a vampire. And then you have the dance scene, which normally I detest dance sequences in the middle of movies, but there is something like really charmingly 80s about this one. Especially with, you know, the back and forth between the two of them, and then it gives Carrie like a chance to really show off like his physicality. He gets to do the leg guitar thing that he can do. So that's probably one of the more memorable scenes in the movie. So it's like it's just probably, it seems like that could work back in the 80s. It's probably why people are still trying it today, and it just fails miserably. So yeah, or maybe I'm just being generous, but it's one of the few scenes in the movie that really does work, at least for me anyway. But then, obviously, the movie, even though you can tell, I was talking about how it's doesn't seem to have much material and there's a lot of filler in it. Luckily, it is only an hour and a half. Sometimes movies that don't have enough material and put filler in are like brutal enough that they'll try to stretch out to like 2 hours or something. But the movie does start to move pretty quickly when it gets to its climax. You could say it's rushed, but I mean, the movie knows when it's done. So you can give it that. And it does reach its inevitable climax, and, you know, has a decent comedic payoff to the whole plot. So yeah. So the comedy doesn't always work, and that's probably being nice. But I don't know what it is. I've seen this movie, like, more than a few times. And I don't know. Even though I can acknowledge that a lot of the scenes that are trying to be funny aren't, there's just kind of a charm in the movie somewhere that I can't quite identify. And is it because this is one of those movies where back in the day, Comedy Central played it like constantly, and I watched it at least a few times there. And as you can see, I own it for some reason, and I've watched it since I've owned it. So I don't know. I honestly don't know what it is, because I would say almost objectively, it's not good. But there's just something. But there is something that kind of keeps taking me. Like it's. I guess because it's like it's an easy watch. Like it's really not. It's anything but demanding. And yes, I don't know. Maybe it's the characters. I don't know. Or maybe it's the little things that do work from time to time. Maybe it's Cleavon Little single-handedly. That could be. But yeah. So. So yeah, I don't know. It's a mystery to me how this movie keeps coming back in my life. But obviously, if we're talking, you know, a preference here, Vampire's Kiss kind of goes way beyond some of the things that might seem like it's doing at a surface level, and is doing a lot more. Maybe I could see some complaints that it might be trying to do too much at once. When it could be simpler, but I don't know, just kind of the more ambitious the movie gets and Cage's performance gets, the more appeal, I think, and the more there's kind of something more in there than it just seems to be. So, yeah, so that's how I feel about these two. So, we're going to go into zombie territory next week, obviously, with the release of Zombieland Double Tap. You can only imagine what one of the movies is, so... so yeah, so I tried to stick with, like, zombie comedies is what I went for, which is how it ended up with the movie it ended up with, so... we're going to keep up the comedic vibe we have going on here for next week. And then the one after that is Stephen King territory, I think. So that'll be fun. So, yeah, and then obviously reviews will keep coming. The videos with my brother are coming. So, yep, as I keep saying, just pretty much a constant month this month. So, until we get to the next ones, I think that's it.